So next we have the great Bill Wohlforth. I say that with no jest at all because I think he's the most universally loved person in the field. That is my feeling. I mean, I don't know a single person who doesn't like Bill Wohlforth. How can you say that for someone who's been in this field almost 30 years? It's ridiculous. But anyway, he is. And it's for good reason because he's great. And also, Bill is like one of these people who's like, it was like the old Howard Cosell. There's like three people in the field I would say this about. Mearsheimer, Bill, and Bob Jervis. Like when they're at an event, it's an event. And if you know Howard Cosell, like Howard Cosell made everything an event, you know, so whether you liked him or didn't like him. So this is an event because Bill is officially here. All right, so Bill will be giving his paper, Theory, Counterfactuals, and the U.S. Grand Strategy Debate. And his discussant will be also the great, universally loved Lauren Muscott, who was the managing editor of Security Studies, and we all miss her greatly. At least I do, that's for sure. Okay, Bill, you got the floor. Unmute.
Hey, thanks, Randy. That's too nice. I wish I could have filmed that and sent that to my mother.
It's recording.
Oh, good. I can get that, just that one clip, send it to my mom. I can't see her now because of the pandemic, but that would make her really feel good. Big thanks to the Mershon Center. Been there many times over the years. Productive, awesome, interesting conversations. Are you guys hearing me okay? Do I need to put the mic on? You're hearing me okay? And also, I just had to take this opportunity to thank Lauren. I'm one of the co-chairs of the editorial board of Security Studies, so I have a not quite as up close a view of what she did for that journal over the years, but at least sort of a third party view of it, and it was quite remarkable. And I'm delighted to have her as my discussant. You know, there's nothing like a title, Theory and Counterfactuals, to draw that audience in. I mean, I can see the participant numbers have shrunk dramatically from this morning, and it's totally understandable. Wow, I really selected that title just to pull that audience in, man. Just to, you know. But at the end of the day, the core claim here is that, and I think it's a premise of this conference, is that in some sense, either you know, theoretically or in practice, America does face a choice. Does it stay engaged in the world as much as it has been? Does it pull back? And if it pulls back, how dramatically? And if you're going to make a decision on a question like that, you know, frankly, whether you know it or not, you're dealing with theory, because you're asking how will the world work and how well will that world work for the United States if it pulls back. And there's no way to know that because we haven't pulled back yet. There's no way to know that. And so basically one way to evaluate the different grand strategies that are in this debate is to ask how good are the arguments for what that counterfactual world would look like. It's a very hard question, grand strategy. And at the end of the day, I don't think countries really make big decisions about grand strategy. I think that it sort of emerges, but it's still useful from the standpoint of debate and the standpoint of analytical thinking, the standpoint of being a good scholar and a good citizen, to think about how you would resolve this question if you were running the country. And in order to do that, you do need to be clear about your theory, frankly, as boring as it might be. So this paper that I uploaded for the conference is one part of a gigantic paper. I say gigantic not in its importance or how good it is, but in terms of its actual size. It's 22,000 words right now. So I did inflict that thing on you. That's one of 4 sections in the paper. What I'm going to do in my talk today is kind of walk through those 4 sections, but I'm going to do it really quickly and linger, of course, on the one section that is the subject of the paper that I circulated. What we were trying to do in this paper was get to a cost-benefit analysis of the main grand strategies that scholars of international security normatively prefer. That is what they think the US should do. That is distinct from another thing that scholars do, which is to try to explain and understand what the United States actually does. 2 quite distinct enterprises. The one I'm interested in is a normative one. It's what experts, we know how important experts are. Randy explained that to us earlier today. What experts think the United States should do. And that puts you in a kind of different territory than the territory of explaining what the United States actually does. We wanted to evaluate the costs and the benefits of the various grand strategies that these scholars normatively urge upon the United States government. But to get there, we had to go through three previous steps, three steps sort of to get us to the fourth and final step, which is the cost-benefit analysis. First, we had to sort of narrow and simplify the debate to three grand strategic options, what we call deep engagement, offshore balancing, and restraint. And we argue that those capture most of the stakes in the debate among academics or among scholars of international security. Second, we need to unpack the key arguments of each of these options and clarify where they part ways. And that's where it becomes clear that offshore balancing and restraint, commonly conflated or thought to be similar or if not identical, those are actually two distinct grand strategy options. And third, we show how each strategy's estimates of the costs and benefits of US engagement, of US alliance posture, onshore presence, that these arguments are contingent upon, the arguments about costs and benefits depend upon, of course, the middle range theories that each strategy uses to forecast what the world will be like if we pull back. And then finally, having gone through all those tasks, we then get to the actual attempt to put numbers as best we can, or at least to provide metrics, if you can use an overused word, to help you make your decision that you're going to have to make as to which grand strategy you prefer and which you think the United States should follow. I'm now going to try to quickly go through these things, super quick, just to give us something to talk about, maybe give you something else besides theory to sink your teeth into when I'm done in another 20 minutes or so. I've been given, I believe, a half an hour to work with. I'm going to see if I can share my screen. Let's see here. I just put up a quick slide here. Where is that? Obviously, clunky behavior here. And try to share the screen and see if you allow. Yep, I have to allow Zoom to share the screen. All right, I guess I can't do this.
No, you can.
How do I do it?
Well, hit share screen.
Yeah.
I have all panelists allowed to do it. So
Oh, okay.
Go ahead. Yeah.
Should be sharing now, right?
Yeah. Well, you have to pick something.
No, yeah, I got to put something out there.
Yeah.
Oh, wait a minute.
You got a lot of things up there now. Oh, you want that figure?
No, I know. Okay.
So hit that.
So this is what we want to show very quickly. The first part of the paper seeks to kind of focus the debate on the three italicized strategies here.
Something's wrong.
Okay.
Maybe you have it too big. Yeah. Try to get it in the center.
Oh, okay.
You have it all the way to the left now. You're getting it. Go to the center.
Can you see it?
Yeah, but go more to the center. There you go.
Don't worry about it.
Slideshow. Do slideshow from current slide. Play from current slide.
That's what I did.
Do it again.
You're not seeing that, huh?
I'm seeing it. You're seeing it. Go ahead. That's good. Good enough.
Yeah, I should have anticipated these kinds
No,
of
we can see it. It's good.
Oh, okay. So at any rate, the slide here simply tries to array most of the strategies that scholars have talked about on a kind of continuum from the least to the most effort or intervention by the United States in the world to try to structure the strategic environment beyond the shores of the United States, to structure the strategic environment in ways favorable to US interests. You can see the least interventionist in the sense of trying to do anything to affect the workings of the world is isolationism or neo-isolationism, and the most is this thing called liberal hegemony or primacy. And basically, I don't want to spend a lot of time on this. We essentially argue that most of the debate among academics can be captured by the three italicized strategies. We know that some very influential scholars have argued for something called liberal internationalism. And Henry Now, who was mentioned in the first conversation, the first session today, talks about a strategy called conservative internationalism. For various reasons, they involve more efforts to shape the global environment in favor of the United States than does deep engagement. But at the end of the day, if you look at the community of scholars who really get involved deeply in this debate on grand strategy, overwhelmingly the preference is for less engagement than we currently have, less engagement than is prescribed by deep engagement, fewer commitments abroad. And therefore, in some sense, all of the scholars who are lower down on this continuum than deep engagement still care about the debate among these three grand strategies. And we furthermore argue that they are useful insofar as the three grand strategies that I had up on that slide really construe the whole problem of grand strategy and the interests of the United States in very similar terms. It makes it easier to compare them. So that's the first section of the paper. The second section seeks to unpack the core arguments of these three grand strategies, showing where they advise the United States to be engaged and where they don't. And that is what essentially reveals that offshore balancing and restraint are distinct strategies. They all essentially ask the same question, which is how can the United States get the most security and prosperity for the lowest price in blood and treasure? And this is the basic trade-off they're all seeking to resolve. Deep engagement suggests that the cost of retaining overseas commitments that are roughly look like the ones we have today, perhaps scaled back from some of the overextension in the Middle East, that these costs are worth paying because it makes it possible for the United States to do four things that essentially every president up to and Donald Trump agreed were important things for the United States to do. The first is to lower the chances that a hostile power could ever dominate Europe or Asia or Eurasia to such an extent as to constitute a threat to the United States of America. But even if there's no hegemon like that on the horizon, engagement serves a second goal, which is to deter rivalries in these regions, to make these regions more secure than they would otherwise be, in order to lower the probability of arms races, security dilemmas, and wars that could cause turbulence abroad that would redound negatively for the security and welfare of American citizens. Wars abroad, even if they don't hit US territory, are matters of concern to the United States in a world of interdependence, according to this grand strategy. Costs can be measured economically, it can be measured in terms of your quality of life, your ability to travel, the ability of business to go abroad. The third goal is that these alliances, these security commitments, help the United States promote and shape a liberal economic order. We know and love this liberal economic order. To expand the global economy and advance US economic interests. And finally, the strategy argues that holding on to these security commitments gives the United States leverage and influence that it can use to shape international cooperation in institutions, both formal institutions like the UN and more informal institutional arrangements, and thereby allow cooperation on issues that cross borders that the United States can't solve on its own. So that's the big array of reasons, that's the reasoning behind the reason deep engagement says we should essentially sustain these security commitments abroad. Now, the other two grand strategies on the surface seem to be very similar. They say there's only one reason for the United States to go abroad, and that is to prevent a hegemon in Eurasia that could threaten the United States. Now, the people watching me here may wonder, why on earth in the 21st century do we need to be concerned about a modern day Hitler or Stalin conquering Eurasia and then coming after the United States? Like, doesn't that seem so 20th century? And in fact, 3 times in the 20th century, arguments along those lines did cause the United States to go ashore. World War I, World War II, and the Cold War. But you may well ask, is that really relevant today when there are so many things that seem to prevent such a hegemony from occurring in the first place? If you're skeptical of that reason for onshore commitments, then you're in good company, because the grand strategy of restraint basically agrees with you and says the probability of any hegemony emerging in Europe or Asia that could threaten the United States is so vanishingly low that we don't need to worry about it. And indeed, that since such a hegemony is the only thing that really threatens the United States, protected by weak neighbors and vast oceans, there is no need for these security commitments. And indeed, it says the only thing we have to fear is our own inadvisable involvement in some war abroad. So the key thing strategy has to do is keep us from getting engaged in any such war. And the way to do that is essentially to dissolve all of our alliances, bring home, to decommission all of our major bases, bring home all of the troops, and massively slash the defense budget such that we couldn't intervene abroad even if we wanted to. Offshore balancing has a very, very different view. It says we actually still do need to be worried about regional hegemony particularly in Asia. And essentially, it's saying that the rise of China to some sort of regional hegemonic dominance is, in fact, a major threat to U.S. vital interests, and therefore the United States has to remain engaged in Asia and sustain, essentially, its current alliance posture in Asia. So if you hear that, it becomes evident that it's very strange to consider these two grand strategies, offshore balancing and restraint, as the same, given the fact that they part company on the most fundamental national security issue facing the United States today. So there you have it, three grand strategies with three different prescriptions for what the U.S. should do. Deep engagement says basically sustain these alliances and partnerships across the world. Restraint says get rid of all of them and massively slash the defense budget. And offshore balancing is kind of in between the two. Get rid of NATO, get out of the Middle East as much as possible, but double down in Asia. Stay there, keep those alliances because of the rise of China. So those are your three grand strategies. How are we doing on time? Not as well as I hoped, but now let's move to this actual subject that poor Lauren has been asked to discuss, and that's the theoretical underpinnings of these recommendations. I mean, where does this come from? Why do the three grand strategies think these things, this array of regional commitments makes sense? We argue that any grand strategy worth its salt really needs to have some sort of theory to inform its counterfactual in three key areas. One is, how does regional security dynamics work? How do they work without the United States? How do they work with the United States there? Now, how do things like balancing power, nuclear deterrence, and so forth, security competition play out? And they need a model of how international cooperation works. After all, for the last 70 years, the United States has used its influential position in international politics to foster cooperation with within international institutions. So if we were to pull back, how would all that work? You need some theories and models for that. And finally, any debate about pulling back from the world that concerns the degree to which things abroad help or hurt things within the borders of the United States, any such debate really needs some sort of theory about interdependence. How vulnerable is the U.S. to things that happen abroad? You got to have clear thinking about that if you're going to recommend dramatic changes to the U.S. Security posture. So to cut to the chase, and not to bore you all any more than I already am, let me just quickly suggest our bottom line. The bottom line in the paper that I circulated and in this section of the bigger paper is that restraint and deep engagement have pretty clear middle-range theories that explain their positions on the level of U.S. commitments that they recommend. And these are things that are pretty familiar to people who have taken a basic course in international relations, especially a basic course in international security, but a basic intro IR course. Things like offense, defense theory, nuclear deterrence theory, balance of power theory, hegemonic stability theory, theories of economic and security interdependence. If you look at deep engagement and you look at if you look at restraint, they have very, very clear theories for why they think that the world would work the way it would, the way they say it would, if the U.S. pulls back. In a nutshell, deep engagement has all of these theories that suggest without the U.S., cooperation is hard, balancing tends to fail, nuclear weapons tend to proliferate, countries can't control their nuclear very well, the possible of inadvertent war, cooperation is very unlikely without a hegemonic leader, and so on and so forth. The result is this forecast of how god-awful things would be if we pulled back. Restraint says everything would be hunky-dory. Balancing usually works, deterrence is totally pretty reliable, cooperation when states need it, emergency. We don't need some self-appointed hegemonic leader. Economic interdependence, don't worry about it because stuff abroad isn't going to hurt the United States that much. It's when you come to look at offshore balancing that you see it's really, really hard to figure out where they get this recommendation to get out of NATO, get out of the Middle East, but somehow it's vital to our security to maintain a huge and expensive and potentially dangerous commitment to security in Asia. And this can really be found in two of their sort of key areas. The first is the question of what theories govern the recommendation when to go ashore or stay ashore and make these alliance commitments. The answer is really unclear because the strategy as set forth is very unclear on exactly what regional hegemony really means and how do you become a regional hegemon. At times when you read offshore balancing writings, it sounds like you're back in the 20th century, and basically regional hegemony is something that happens when one Hitler-like, Stalin-like state physically conquers territory, takes the resources of that territory under its rule, and then comes after the United States. But at other points, they seem to suggest that hegemony is something that can emerge in a much more informal, less violent process, some sort of unspecified influence. Indeed, they refer to the United States as the hegemon of the Western Hemisphere, even though the United States hasn't seized most of North American territory, and unless I'm missing something on the map, has not seized a single inch of South American territory. So if this is the way it happens, then that means hegemony can kind of occur through some non-violent, non-warlike process. And they've never really reconciled this distinction in their writings between the role of war in attaining regional hegemony. And the result is we don't really know what it is we're trying to prevent and why it would be damaging to American interests. Why can't the United States defend against whatever regional hegemony China is going to put together right here in the North American region? Why do we have to be doing it over there and taking on all those risks? Why can't potentially nuclear, highly capable, often separated by water, regional actors constrain China on their own? What's wrong with Japan? What's wrong with South Korea? What's wrong with these other countries? Why can't they do it on their own? It's just, there's not a set of theories in there, not a set of models that makes it clear why they think this hegemony can happen and why they think it can't happen in other regions. So that's a little bit disconcerting. The key thing to think about is ask yourself this: if we had been following the recommendations of offshore balancing at the end of the Cold War, I think it's pretty clear we would have pulled out of everywhere, not just Middle East and Europe, but also Asia, right? I mean, because China was so weak back then, what would we have been staying in there for? There was no hegemonic threat in the 1990s. So if we had done that, then if you were an offshore balancing proponent, you'd say we have to go ashore now, right now. We have to go ashore. We have to make an alliance with Japan, make an alliance with South Korea, get going in the region. And the question is, why would we do that? What would be the cause? What is the threat to the United States that these alliances would be preventing? I've read carefully what proponents of offshore balancing write, and it's just completely unclear to me what those criteria would be. That then leads to the second sort of source of confusion and imprecision in there, which is, how do you get back into a region once you have left? I mean, the key thing for offshore balancing is this idea that it stands ready to intervene and to get back onshore in a region if necessary. If a hegemon seems to be in the works here, that's going to be a threat to the United States, we'll go back ashore. Balancing fails, we'll help the local actors balance. The question is, how do you do that? What are the conditions under which sovereign states allow another great power into their territory for prolonged periods to create these ramified alliances like the ones we have? The thing is, alliances that actually work well are not easy to create. If you look at the conditions under which the current set of alliances occurred, that was a global war killing 70 million people, and it ended up with 100 Soviet divisions in the center of Europe. Now, if those are the causes that are necessary to allow an alliance network of this nature to form, we don't see anything like that in Asia today, and it's unclear why offshore balancing proponents think it would be so easy to get back on shore. So we don't find underlying models or theories that help us understand what's driving the counterfactuals that must underlie offshore balancing's unique set of prescriptions of coming home elsewhere but staying ashore in Asia. We also go through their theoretical or models that they use to understand interstate cooperation and interdependence. I won't go to those now, but we also find it difficult to parse those. All right, so that gives me 5 minutes for the last section of the paper, where we actually try to get into estimating the cost of benefits. This is one Lauren didn't get because I didn't circulate it to the group. Because you might be sitting there saying, all right, so what? You know, you'll be making the old joke, that's all well and good in practice, but what about theory? You know, why should we pay so much attention to theory? I suggest it's still rather important, but nonetheless, the paper goes on to try to estimate some costs and savings. And I just want to at least put a little bit up here for you so to show there's actually something there before we go over to the discussion. And I'll just put 3 points on the table that come from that. And for that, I'll go back, if I can, to my beautiful slides here. Oh, wait a minute, I have to share the screen first and put this up here. Yeah, there we go. And then we go to this, and then we go to this, and then we go from this current slide. So can you guys see this? I'm seeing thumbs up. Okay. So basically, we go through three kinds of costs. Basically, budgetary outlays for the U.S. national security and foreign policy budget. We go through the costs, the benefits the U.S. gets from the global economy, and we go through the costs of wars. And the easiest thing to portray graphically, but it's also quite eye-opening, are the costs. Some people listening to me may know that I normatively prefer deep engagement as a grand strategy.
Well, just 1 second, because I just figured something out. If you're not seeing the entire graph, and many of you probably aren't, go up to where it says View Options at the top of your page, where it says Share Screen or whatever. View Options. If you have that, do you have that? You hit Zoom ratio 50%. If you're on 100%, you can't see you won't get the whole thing. But if you go up to the top, View Options, choose 50% Zoom ratio, then you can see everything. I hope that helps. Okay, help me.
Okay, I'm hoping that, seeing these things isn't absolutely crucial. The big bottom line is presented on the slide, but I can just say it, namely that the U.S. spends a ton on its international policy. In particular, as of last fiscal year of 2019, approximately 6.2% of GDP. Why is that? That is indeed spelled out on the chart. In order to really figure out how much we spend, you got to look not only at the DoD base budget, what we spend on the Pentagon, but also what we spend on actual wars and overseas operations, what we spend on intelligence, that fraction of the Department of Energy that has to do with nuclear weapons. We have to deal with the Homeland Security, which is partly about defense, your international affairs budget. You have to calculate what we pay to properly provide benefits to veterans. And finally, you have to calculate the interest that you're paying on all the aforementioned costs. So all that added together is looking at a defense budget of last year, that is, say, a foreign policy expenditures of something like 6.2% of GDP, which is a lot of money. So we're not averting our eyes from that reality. What we then do in the paper is try to assess the budgetary cost of the different grand strategies over time from 1994 to 2019, where you have the black line on this chart, for those of you who can see it, representing what the United States actually spent. What a deep engagement strategy would have cost if it didn't involve Iraq. In other words, we're just subtracting the cost of Iraq from the cost the United States actually spent. Of course, that's controversial because some people believe that deep engagement, no matter what its proponents say, would have led us into Iraq anyway. I contest that, but we're not going to debate that here. And then you look at the savings of offshore balancing and restraint. We get restraint from a Cato Institute budget, which is the most elaborate and detailed defense budget ever produced by advocates of restraint. Again, that is a defense budget that's bringing us down to 1.8% of GDP on the Department of Defense, and essentially involving the severing of all of our alliances, the slashing of the United States Navy, the slashing of the Army, the getting rid of a lot of expeditionary corps. It's a very dramatic cut. It's a defense budget that essentially makes it impossible for the United States to go back abroad quickly, and therefore insulates or ensures the United States against imprudent foreign policy adventures, and also saves the United States a ton of money. Had it been adopted since the end of the Cold War, you're talking about huge savings for the United States. Okay, so
so can I just take on this 1 second? When you said 13.9 trillion, you're adding everything from 1994 to 2019?
That's correct.
Oh, okay.
So to get the savings of restraint over the current budget, you simply subtract 13.9 from 25.8, and that's a lot of money being saved. The entire pandemic is estimated by the entire COVID-19 pandemic is expected to cost, in terms of lost economic growth and expenditures, is estimated by the Congressional Budget Office to cost us $8 trillion. So you're looking at, if you had adopted a restraint grand strategy, saving a lot of money. Okay, let me unshare my screen and go back to finish this thing up quickly. So the budget savings are substantial. But what we then argue the next two sections is actually they're not what you want to focus on. They're important, they're not what we want to focus on. For one thing, just note, offshore balancing doesn't save you that much money, primarily because it's continuing to keep some very expensive commitments, notably the one to Asia. Plus, the strategy calls for the US to be ready to come back if necessary. That requires maintaining pretty expensive things. And finally, cutting out of NATO and stuff saves you a lot less money than you think because of the subsidies the United States gets from its hosts. So for all those reasons, offshore balancing doesn't really save you that much money. But the big point here is that two other baskets of costs and benefits are far more important than the budgetary ones. The first one are the economic benefits of global leadership. Now, we don't know how much those benefits are, and we can't calculate them in this paper. But what we can do in this paper is something else. And I'm looking at the time here nervously. What we can do is something else. We can calculate, absorbing the best economics literature we can, how much the United States gets from its interaction with the global economy. How much is it? And then we can try to figure out how much of that would have to come from leadership, namely from having this role in international institutions, from having these alliances, from having this leadership role. How much of that overall pie that we get from interacting with the global economy would you have to get to warrant the expenditures the United States makes for that leadership position? And the key point here is the amount the US gains from its interactions with the globe is so huge that if you're only getting about 5% of that from the leadership position, in other words, if foregoing leadership of the so-called liberal economic order and handing it over to another power or powers would cost the US 5% of what it currently gets from its interaction with the global economy, that dwarfs all the savings that I just showed you on that chart. Many times.
I hate to interrupt you. Just the last time I'm going to interrupt you because I think it's such an important point. Give me any example of what the US gains economic, that 5%. What is in that 5%? How did you calculate, what is a leadership benefit that is economic?
We didn't calculate that in this paper.
You just said 5%, even if it's 5%, what would it be?
We're just saying, because it's very hard to calculate how much the US gets from its leadership position. What we're doing in this paper is trying to give readers metrics that they themselves can use to think through this problem. So
but
the question is,
something in mind?
Sorry?
Don't you have something in mind though when you say 5%?
Yeah, I mean, we can estimate potentially how much the United States gains from having the dollar as a reserve currency. Then you can estimate how much does leadership, security leadership matter for a reserve currency. There's an economics literature on that. You can look at how economic agreements are structured and ask how much does leadership help the United States structure economic agreements in its favor. In each of these cases that are uncertain, what we're saying in this paper is you need to make your own estimate. You might say it's 0, and then you get to your result. But if you think it's 5%, you've just decided the question, because you've just decided that you're gaining more from a US global leadership position than it costs to sustain it. So that's might sound like it's a nice answer from the standpoint of deep engagement, but the last one is a very, very difficult one. That's the cost of war. And I'm running out of time. I'll just say that we go through thinking about how much wars really cost. And obviously, the main cost of them is the human life. And we ignore all the psychological and emotional toll of losing people. We try to reduce it to economic numbers, which is pretty gross in some sense, but it's also incredibly instructive. Major wars are so horrifically expensive that they wash absolutely everything else out of this equation. They make this so the way we do this, we imagine, let's think about the last war the United States fought against a major power, the Korean War. We basically look at the Korean War and imagine it were fought today, and then use the best sort of numbers we can generate as to how much that war cost. And just at the level of pure just outlays for the United States, that is to say, looking at how much the US spent at Korea and how much non-budget spending the war entailed, it would, in today's dollars, be $14 trillion. The only problem is that's only scraping the surface of the cost, because economists have nice models for how much wars affect trade and how much trade benefits the United States. If the US fought China today in a war that was kind of like the Korean War, the economic costs, setting aside the direct costs, so the trade and investment costs, would be in the area of $21 trillion across 3 years. So you're now looking at something like 6 COVID-19s occurring within a 3-year period for a war that actually does not affect US territory. You know, the bottom line is, the way to think about these grand strategies, just to conclude, is you need to think about what their implications are for the likelihood of war and the likelihood of the US being involved in war. And those are really, really crucial. I know a lot of people think, oh, the era of war is over, there's never going to be another major war. And if that's what you think, that will very much help you select these grand strategies. The other question then is, to what degree does US involvement deter war and prevent war versus suck the United States into war? And to what degree will the US get sucked into war whether it's engaged or not? Because if you think we're going to get sucked in anyway, then obviously you would like to be prepared for that. At the end of the day, is we're not answering the questions of this paper. What we're giving readers, we hope to give readers metrics, mental tools, heuristics they can use to think through these grand strategies. But at the end of the day, I think that as of current, as the way it's currently presented, offshore balancing kind of falls out as a not particularly persuasive option. It seems highly unlikely that the costs and benefits of that grand strategy would pan out, as well as the costs and benefits of either of the other two more or less engaged alternatives. And with that, having run a solid 5 minutes over, I am going to shut up and look forward to hearing any, first of all, Lauren's comments and then the discussion.
Yeah, we're gonna have a lot of discussion. Lauren, you're up. But by the way, you remember how Groucho Marx used to have a word, and if you said it, the duck would fall down? My word was at the end of the day, and you said it 5 times. Well, that was my phrase. But okay, go ahead, Lauren. I just have, my little quirks. But it was a great talk. Thank you.
Yes, and I'll keep my comments short as well. I'm sure there'll be a lot of really great discussion. I want to thank Randy for first the very kind introduction and also inviting me to participate in the conference. And thank you, Bill, for this really interesting paper and our little security studies reunion in this little panel. So luckily, I love theory, so I'm happy to talk about that element of the paper, and I'm excited to see the larger project as well once it's complete. So I just want to start with some things that I really appreciated about the paper, and then just give a few comments or questions for the project as it moves forward. And this is just speaking about that one section. So forgive me if these points are addressed in the other sections of the paper. So something I really appreciated about this paper was that it did embrace the normative dimension of grand strategy, the should of grand strategy. And it didn't, and while grand strategy can be guided by different values, prudence, economic, utility, I appreciated that this explicitly took the should head on. I also appreciated how it distinguishes grand strategy from grand theory, and spent some time uncoupling the two concepts and how we tend to try to link grand strategy to particular grand theories. So I found that discussion really, really helpful and useful. And also identifying what specific mid-range theories or middle range theories that grand strategy should have, including an understanding of the nature of security competition, the nature of international cooperation, and the nature of international interdependence. And also the central point or central contribution of this paper, the logical ambiguities and at times contradictions of offshore balancing, and really exploring those. So for comments, with it being exploring the normative elements of grand strategy, I wish there was more explicit engagement with values. What are the values guiding this grand strategy? And one reason I think that the values embedded in these different grand strategies are more implicit than explicit is that there seems to be an inherent realism in each of the grand strategies as currently described, which is perfectly fine. We're in a realist foreign policy conference, but it would be interesting to see what different, if these grand strategies and these logics hold with different values. I saw Rick Herman was in attendance here. I'd be curious if more psychological values, concerns about image or role, played a part in determining grand strategy. Would we be okay with complete restraint if it was a completely what we saw as degenerate, great power, to use image theory language? And then finally, my last point here is more about the broader literature on grand strategy, and not necessarily this particular paper, but what I would find interesting to hear more about was also the quality and nature of engagement. In the paper, engagement is, I understood it to be a financial or military troop commitment to onshore balancing or presence or deep cooperation. But there's different forms of deep engagement I could see, where on one end of the spectrum you have a Wentian world state where there's very deep engagement with other nations, and then also pure empire or imperialism where there's deep engagement but no consent. So I'd be curious if those type of distinctions, whether in the literature in this particular project, what that would involve. And I'll end up wrapping up there. I'm sure folks have really great interventions on the policy element, but I really appreciated this paper and enjoyed reading that.
Brief. That is incredibly brief and good. Thank you. Brevity is like something in very short supply at these things. Okay. I don't have very many hands and stuff. I want to ask one question, just lead off, just for clarification. So, Bill, at the end, I know your work because I teach it in class, and I think that what you were referring to when you were saying at the end that you, what is the cost of a war, blah, blah, blah. I think you were saying that this was a defense of more engagement, right? Because you see the U.S. as a pacifier. No, restraint, was that restraint?
No, I'm saying that in this paper, we're not advocating for any given strategy.
So you weren't.
In this paper, we're suggesting what you would have to think in order to end up supporting one or the other strategy.
So you weren't making the, because like in your paper with with Eikenberry and Brooks, right, in international security, I believe, don't you make the case that that war, that by the U.S. being the pacifier in these regions, we're tamping down the security dilemma, making war less likely?
Yeah, that's right. But in this paper, yeah, no, I'm still saying that. But in this paper, we're not getting into the debates. We're suggesting what you would have to believe about the cost of war and the likelihood of the United States getting involved in war in order to support or not support one of the different grand strategies. In fact, the section that I just mentioned, I think probably on balance will probably be read as it will sound a lot like it's favoring restraint, because what it's saying is how unbelievably, just imponderably horrible the costs of war are, and particularly if the United States is involved. And that section says nothing about all these other benefits of engagement that Brooks and Eikenberry and others stress. All of this, we get to have cooperation among states, like all the, what would happen with with environmental cooperation and all these other kinds of things without the United States. There's nothing about that in those sections. That section is entirely on the territory of restraint. And so I think it's likely to be read as being quite favorable toward, as focusing the mind on what restraint wants your mind to be focused on, which is don't get in one of these wars, avoid it if all possible.
Okay, then that's totally consistent. I was thinking that's very logical. I was just thinking I was thinking you were making a debate because I was reading your paper from before, and I thought that that was one of your arguments, that like where the cost of deep engagement, one of the costs of retrenchment, I thought you were saying, is that it makes war more likely. And so I'm not sure you're consistent. Your logic seems perfect in this paper, but I'm not sure it's consistent with what you wrote with Eikenberry and Brooks. Maybe I'm misreading it.
Yeah, it might not be. I mean, this paper is doing something different. I'm capable of taking off the hat of someone who believes that that deep engagement is probably best for the United States, and stepping back and trying to evaluate the debate. I've always thought, you know, I do. If I had a bias going in, it is perhaps that I've always thought restraint to be the most powerful alternative to deep engagement. If I had to pick someone to debate in front of an audience, you know, the one I would least like to debate is an articulate and persuasive, thoughtful proponent of restraint. The other grand strategies, I find it much easier to debate. In response to Lauren's quick questions, I wanted to quickly say, yeah, I mean, we totally, I mean, the debate is about a debate among a particular subset of international security scholars. And it's true that there's a kind of realist take in that they conceive of national interests of the United States in terms of the welfare and the security of the citizens of the United States of America. That's essentially, you could call that a normative judgment in and of itself, saying the proper way to think about grand strategy is to think about it in terms of the national interest. Now, I think everybody, you know, we're all human, so people who support these grand strategies also think of other things. And so, for example, restraint, people will occasionally say that their grand strategy is better for the world because it gets the United States out of everybody's business. It lets countries be countries without an America trying to be a global policeman. But people who favor deep engagement say, look, this so-called much hated liberal international order that everybody's dumping on has in fact seen the greatest reduction in poverty in the history of the world. It's seen all these accomplishments. So they do care about other issues. But for the purpose of debating and assessing the strategies, they do make the claim that fundamentally they must make the case in terms of classical national interest terms that have to do with the welfare and security of American citizens, but also presumably preserving the United States as it is, as a democratic polity. It preserves its integrity as the country that it is. And finally, on the nature of engagement, yeah, that term deep engagement really is meant to distinguish the US security partnerships from the traditional alliances that typically formed in international politics for centuries prior to the end of the Cold War. It's that institutionalized nature, the permanent stationing of troops, the long-term forces in place agreements the United States has with all these countries. If you look at the history of international politics, that's extremely unusual. And so the term deep is meant to capture that unusual kind of institutionalized, ramified nature of the US alliance network.
So, okay, let me get these, let's ask 4 questions in a row. So this is how I'm gonna start. I'm gonna start with Lindsay Cohn, then I'm gonna go to Katie Powers, then I'm gonna go to Chris Ray, then I'm gonna go to John Mueller. So Lindsay, you're first, go ahead.
Thanks, Randy. Thanks, Bill. This was really great. I enjoyed it a lot. And I'm sorry if this question is asking you to go over something that you already went over. My internet was going in and out, so you kept on cutting out for me, and I wasn't able to see the paper. But I was really interested in the idea of the different defense budgets. I know I've seen another paper somewhere that does that as well, builds different defense budgets for different proposed grand strategies. But following on Lauren's point about different types of engagement being possible, I'd be really interested to hear sort of what types of cuts you would make, or in your theoretical scenarios, what types of cuts you would make to military budgets for those 3 different italicized strategies.
Katie.
This was great. Bill, I can't believe I had to come all the way to Zoom to see you give this paper presentation when you would normally be down the hall. My question is actually about sort of the calculation of costs, and namely the first thing that struck me when you showed the plot of the sort of defense budgets and the different costs of different strategies was, I wonder how or to what extent you've accounted for like opportunity costs. In other words, sure, it's not all that much cheaper to deploy this restraint strategy, but what happens with the money that you save? And so I'm curious how that plays into your theory or your calculations, and I'd just love to hear you say more.
Chris Ray.
Yeah, thanks. Also, thought was a very cool topic about counterfactual visuals, especially really good ones. Hard to do. That was really cool. So my question is, you talked about this desire to provide sort of a heuristic to help structure thinking about this aspect of grand strategy, which is a psych and IR person I really liked, because it seemed to recognize both that heuristics are inevitable ways to engage with thinking and that they're primarily useful. But of course, the flip side of that, of heuristics, is that they introduce these systemic errors, biases. So I was just curious, what do you think, looking at this, are the most likely biases and sort of errors to come out of this process? I mean, if you're thinking, well, this is going to be a heuristic to help structure our thinking in some ways that, you know, we don't really think enough about grand strategy in terms of, which I bought from the talk that you gave. What are the downsides of bringing that in? What are you worried that might smuggle in any misconceptions about thinking about grand strategy?
Finally, John Mueller, and then I will get to David McCord afterwards, but John?
Okay, this may have been covered. It basically springs from Randy's question. It's partly covered, but if with this huge emphasis you have on avoiding war, selective engagers and people like that could potentially say, well, what we're trying to do is actually, by doing this, is reduce the danger of war. If you relax, you're going to get wars. So do you have that built in? In other words, you're not necessarily more likely to get into wars with those strategies. The argument for it would be that you're less likely.
Yeah, go ahead, Bill, then I'll get some more questions.
Yeah, just for your information, Randy, I'm seeing a couple of questions up here on the Q&A.
I'm going to get them. I'm going to get them in. And you want me to read them now? I will.
Just want to share. Yeah. So yeah, these are great. In the paper, we do try to get into a little bit of the detail. Frankly, the best detail. So I have also seen that. I think there was a great think tank report which went through all these different grand strategies. They didn't reduce it to 3, and they then estimated the defense budgets for all of them. We looked at that, but the most detailed one was really that Cato one on what a restraint one would look like. We have to kind of infer what offshore balancing would look like based on their writings. And finally, with deep engagement, we basically accepted that it would essentially be similar to what the United States currently spends. Again, some deep engagers are on record, and we're on record opposing the Iraq War before it happened. So we stress that it's not logically inevitable that if you're a supporter of deep engagement that you thought Iraq was a great idea. But for the purposes of this paper, we essentially just say, well, deep engagement entails greater risk of potential temptation to overreact, and therefore maybe deep engagement should take that cost. I don't know, it's a debate. But so we do get into a decent amount of detail, but not the granular detail that's probably necessary going forward. On Katie's question about opportunity cost, great question. We don't do that in the paper. Namely, if the United States could save 15 trillion over X period of time, what would have happened to the 15 trillion? And would that then have led to greater economic growth or other goods in the United States? We don't get into that. It's highly contentious. When Brooks and I wrote our book, I tried to review the economics literature on the cost of defense spending and how do you model the counterfactual? Like, what would we be spending the money on if we weren't spending it on defense? Would it be tax cuts for the rich? Would it be great roads and schools? Like, what would it be? Would it be less debt? It's really, really hard to estimate, but I think we do need to mention that and deal with that in the paper, and we don't right now. On the potential of biases, I think the biggest bias of this literature is the bias of accepting the categories of costs and benefits from experience. Namely, we look at what international politics has been like for the last couple of hundred years, the last 50 years, the last 20 years, and those are the inputs into our thinking. Whereas what this pandemic shows is that things can happen that are just not a part of your sense of the kinds of costs and benefits that a grand strategy needs to think about. Now, I happen to think that being engaged in international cooperation are important for pandemics, blah, blah, blah. But at the end of the day, I think that's the main bias, this looking back, kind of myopia, thinking about wars. At the end of the day, however, Ohio State University is the home to one of my favorite scholars, Bear Braumüller, and I have to say that I'm persuaded by his work that we should not stop thinking about the possibility of one of these major wars just because one hasn't occurred for a long time. Indeed, to get to John Mueller's question, one of the reasons people like me think there haven't been as many of these wars is precisely because of United States engagement. That's fundamentally the debate. It's this trade-off between even if you believe engagement reduces the probability of wars, to what degree does it increase the probability the United States gets involved in a war? And to what degree can the United States ensure itself against involvement by not having alliances? Remember, all the previous times the United States went ashore and committed to onshore presence, it didn't have alliances. So obviously it doesn't require an alliance for the United States to conclude that it needs to go ashore. Something we could do a grand strategy of restraint. We could pull them all home, get rid of all the bases, slash the defense budget, and then suddenly something might happen and we feel we need to go abroad again. After all, that happened 3 times in the past. So we don't answer these questions, I'm afraid, in this paper. This paper is not advocating for one strategy or the other. The only strategy this paper does have in the crosshairs, and it kind of has it in for, is offshore balancing. I would like to like offshore balancing because it's this nice Goldilocks thing, it's kind of like not as sort of radical an experiment as restraint, but it still has these commitments, but I just can't get its pieces to hang together. So that's the one where we kind of do come, but we don't really tell the reader what to think, or we don't think we know how to tell the reader what to think between deep engagement and restraint. We think there's a lot of more thinking that needs to be done, but at least we try to give these parameters of these units of analysis to think about in trying to make your own judgment.
Okay, Simon Rush, I have you here. Welcome.
Thank you.
You're allowed to speak and read your own questions or say whatever you want.
Thank you very much. I actually have 2 questions. I don't know whether that's overstepping the line or
No,
not.
it's okay.
But, okay, thank you. The first question, Bill, I wanted to ask you, followed up on Lauren's comment, which is that you start from a rationalist position, which I perfectly understand, and you're comparing cost benefits on the basis of the rationalist position. I just wondered whether you had, at any point in the big essay, the 22,000 words, explored the question of non-rationalist positions about threat perception, the construction of the notion of threat, and how that would affect the way in which people think about and talk about these various different constructions of strategy. I mean, I understand the position you're coming from. I just wondered whether you'd explore beyond that. My second question was that in your calculation of cost, I perfectly understand and respect the way you constructed it. But one factor that you don't take into account, which is potentially calculable, is counter strategies, the way in which other states construct their grand strategies and what effect that's likely to have, especially when you focus so much on the Indo-Pacific as a potential area. One of the drawbacks of American grand strategy construction is we don't think necessarily about how other powers, great and small, construct them. And I just wondered whether you'd given that any thought, and how it might affect the way in which you calculate the costs. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Simon. David McCourt, go ahead if you're here. There you are. You have to unmute.
Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, great.
Yeah, just a quick question about the differences between strategies in a military security sort of vein and more diplomatic focused strategies. When you say there that when you're importing biases, part of the problem of talking about strategies is that they do seem to be sort of military based, right? But I can perfectly imagine a deep engagement diplomatic strategy that invests tons of money in the State Department, cultural influence, organizations around the world, alliances, and this has been a sort of a critique of the Trump administration. So it's a question really about how does the distinction between diplomatic strategies or diplomacy in general and military security aspects of strategies play into the story that you're telling and the work you're doing? Thanks.
Yeah, now let's see. I have Chris Jopi with some strange thing on it, like a cloud. I don't know what that means.
That means he's recording. He's recording.
Oh, he's recording. Okay. Okay. So, Bill, you can answer, but in the meantime, you know, if anyone has questions, go right ahead because we're out of questions right now. Go ahead, Bill.
Well, you know, there's no harm in ending the session early, Randy.
I know. I will.
In fact, it's a beautiful day here in New Hampshire, absolutely stunning. So if the
Beautiful.
conference were down, you know, a few minutes early, it's not the end of the world.
Yeah.
No, I love this, and deeply indebted that people are engaged here. So yeah, I think all of these are things that I have thought a lot about, but don't have in the paper, to be quite honest. I mean, so constructions of threats, and we have that in the paper in the sense that in a couple of ways. And I recall that David this morning mentioned this idea about how, you know, how he doesn't feel like that China represents a territorial threat. I mean, what we really like about restraint is that it's incredibly clear and austere about what it views as a threat. It really does view a threat as a situation in which some gigantic Eurasian hegemon can basically dictate terms of the United States and take away American sovereignty, basically make America no longer be an autonomous, independent actor, can hold it hostage, can threaten it, can coerce it. That's what they think a threat is. And it doesn't require, I don't want to caricature the restraint people, it doesn't require armies to come across the border. It doesn't require something like, you know, like man in the high castle and occupation of the United States territory, but it's really concrete. Whereas the minute you move away from that, they do get more notional. And I do think that these issues of how we think about it are important. But in the case of restraint, they basically say, we restraint people are afraid of people making threats, mountainous threats out of molehills. And that's why we want to make it basically impossible for the United States to intervene, because we don't think most of the stuff the United States does abroad is necessary. The costs element. Let's see. What do we have? How come I'm failing to read my own handwriting here? You're going to have to remind me of the second one there, Simon. I can't read my own handwriting, but for the moment, I'll go to David.
My second question concerned the comparative costs of grand strategies of other countries as they intersect with the United States.
So so obviously, yeah. So one of the big concerns is what do other, in calculating the costs, the question is what do other countries do in response? So that's central to the entire debate. And there was a time when people who advocated restraint argued that, and people who advocate offshore balancing too, they argue that too forward-leaning an American posture will cause the grand strategies of other powers to change. In particular, they focus in recent years on Russia, and that Russia's dominant strategy becomes cooperation with China only in a world in which the United States is up against Russia's door. So they argue that one of the benefits of the United States, one of the costs of engagement, and one of the benefits of disengagement is possibly to create space between Russia and China and reduce pressure on US grand strategy overall. So that's definitely part of the debate. Yeah.
Bill, oh, you're not done. Okay.
Reducing this to military commitments. I mean, on the one hand, you're right. It's crazy to reduce everything to military commitments. On the other hand, I think it's important to remind people that that's the most sort of concrete manifestation of the debate. It's the aspect of the debate which you get real distinctions among people. Because if you were to, again, to remind you, we're looking at normative recommendations by scholars. I'm not aware of any scholar of international relations that is in favor of denuding the State Department of funding. I have never met a scholar of international relations who thinks that we should use the Pentagon to solve every problem and we shouldn't use diplomacy. I'm just not aware of that. So they all basically agree that we need to have an adroit diplomacy, we need to have a properly staffed federal bureaucracy for dealing with the rest of the world, and so on and so forth. Where they part ways is on whether we sustain these alliances. I don't want to reduce it all to that, but it's a really, really big question. And the election of Donald Trump, to go back to the first session this morning, has really put that question front and center in a way that it hasn't been in the past. I mean, do we want these things? Because you can lose them either by decision or by a corrosion of the alliances through the kinds of behavior, the kinds of discussion, the kinds of rhetoric that we've seen. And so those alliances are central to the debate. And so focusing on them enables you to make the debate much more concrete and tractable than it would otherwise be.
Bill, I just want one thing to end, so I want to defend I want to be Steve Walt and John Mearsheimer defending, because I thought it was a very powerful part of your talk was when you said you don't understand offshore balancing, that it doesn't have a theoretical underpinning. So I want to take one of their, because I always assign your work for my class, so I know it very well. So if I'm acting like you're contradicting yourself and I know it, it's not because I looked it up, it's just on the top of my head. So you used to write things like, when you wrote 20 years ago about the difference in preponderance, you used to talk about things like dysfunctional alliances. You'd say you need a hegemon because alliance formation, while balance of power works, alliance formation is often very spasmodic, it's often dysfunctional and pathological. So a hegemon gets them together. So I was reading just now to see what Walt and Mearsheimer said, and they actually kind of use your words. They say, ideally, Washington would rely on local powers to contain China, but that strategy might not work. Not only is China likely to be much more powerful than its neighbors, but these states are also located far from one another, making it harder to form an effective balancing coalition. The United States will have to coordinate their efforts and may have to throw its considerable weight behind them. So isn't that consistent with your kind of notion that you used to write, you know, the balancing was often pathological, but it happens better with a hegemon. So wouldn't their theory be collective action problems?
It is when they talk about that specific issue, but then it isn't on any other issue. So I want to understand why it only applies there and not elsewhere. We looked hard and closely at their writings.
Geography.
Particular, yeah, and so Mearsheimer does have in his 2001 book a story about the geography, how the geography plays out in a U.S.-China contest. In other words, I've looked in vain in their works for how these geographical arguments play out without the United States in the region. So he's got a detailed story about how geography works between the United States, with the United States there, but I'm not sure how it works with the United States not there because they've never really gotten into that. But yes, deep engagement and offshore balancing overlap on Asia. It's just not clear why only in Asia does offshore balancing take these arguments and nowhere else do they take these arguments. Why states are rational and nuclear deterrence works in some places, but states are not wholly efficient balancers, and nuclear deterrence doesn't work in other regions. It's just not clear.
I think that's a great point. I think they should write a paper, because I have the answer off the top of my head, that addresses that exact problem. Says our logic is that in Asia, you have very unbalanced situation, unlike in Europe. Geography, well, they just said that. Geography keeps them far apart, and they're unbalanced, and so it would be much better to have a hegemon to coordinate their efforts and avoid the free rider problem. So I think you've raised a great paper. I think you've pointed out what they need to say, but I still think they have a pat argument to make in response to that.
If they do, but just answer that. If they do, that's great. But if they do, they need to say what it is that is being balanced. Because if it's a Chinese conquest of their territory or a Chinese effort to remove them as sovereign actors from the international system, it's still unclear why water and nuclear weapons don't defend against that. So they're talking about some kind of much more informal hegemony that somehow can occur through some kind of salami tactic thing. Yeah. Maybe China gets an island here and a feature there, and somehow we wake up and they're hegemons. But never in their writing have they said, what does that hegemony look like and why is it a threat to the United States?
Yeah, I think that's a great point. All right, with that, we will end this session. Thank you, Bill. Thank you, Lauren.